Rebel returns. Dominic Cummings faces a Commons committee and few parts of government escape unscathed.
When the public needed us most, the government failed. The Secretary of State for Health should have been fired for at least 15, 20 things. You've got tens and tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die.
Boris Johnson's former advisor was brutal about his one-time boss, calling him complacent and unfit for office. His response to COVID, he said, had been disastrous. The Health Secretary too took a battering during 7 hours of bruising testimony. But did Mr Cummings manage to land a significant blow on the government? Also tonight, the fury of the Hillsborough families as their final legal fight ends in bitter disappointment. Another blow for the High Street. Big losses for M&S with more shop closures to come. And sailing down memory lane with the Cambridges. The Duke and Duchess return to St Andrews, where they first met.
This is the ITV Evening News with Mary Nightingale.
Good evening. Boris Johnson's former chief advisor delivered a scathing assessment of the government's response to the pandemic today. Dominic Cummings said tens of thousands of people had died unnecessarily because of its failures. Mr Cummings was at the very heart of that decision-making before being sacked, and he apologised for letting the public down. During a marathon hearing in Parliament, he claimed the Prime Minister initially dismissed coronavirus as a scare story and that by last autumn, Mr Cummings viewed him as unfit for the job. But perhaps his harshest criticism was reserved for the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. He called him a liar who should have been sacked multiple times. Our political correspondent Romilly Weeks was watching.
If you were under the impression that Dominic Cummings had already spilled all the beans on his time in government, then over the course of 7 hours of detailed evidence to MPs, the Prime Minister's former chief aide was out to prove that very wrong. Sounding uncharacteristically nervous, he started, perhaps wisely, with an apology.
The truth is that senior ministers, senior officials, senior advisors like me fell disastrously short of the standards that the public has a right to expect of its government in a crisis like this. When the public needed us most, the government failed. And I'd like to say to all the families of those who died unnecessarily, how sorry I am for the mistakes that were made and for my own mistakes at that.
Downing Street claimed the Prime Minister wasn't watching. If he had, he would have heard his government painted as woefully underprepared for a pandemic that he himself failed to take seriously.
In February, the Prime Minister regarded this as just a scare story. He described it as the new swine flu.
Did you tell him it wasn't?
Certainly. But the view of various officials inside Number 10 was if we have the Prime Minister chairing Cobra meetings and he just tells everyone it's swine flu, don't worry about it, I'm going to get Chris Whitty to inject me live on TV with coronavirus so everyone realises it's nothing to be frightened of, that would not help.
The Health Secretary too might have looked rather less cheerful about his morning run if he'd known what was coming.
Are you worried about Dominic Cummings giving evidence today, Mr Hancock?
I think that the Secretary of State for Health should have been fired for at least 15, 20 things, including lying to everybody in multiple occasions, in meeting after meeting in the Cabinet room and publicly. I said repeatedly to the Prime Minister that he should be fired. So did the Cabinet Secretary, so did many other senior people.
As for one of the gravest mistakes of the pandemic, the release of hospital patients into care homes without testing, that too he laid at Matt Hancock's door.
Hancock told us in the Cabinet room that people were going to be tested before they went back to care homes. What the hell happened? Now, all the government rhetoric was we put a shield around care homes and blah, blah, blah. It was complete nonsense. Quite the opposite of putting a shield around them. We sent people with COVID back to the care homes.
Matt Hancock might now regret his supportive tweet for Dominic Cummings when he broke lockdown rules by fleeing to Barnard Castle. On that, Mr Cummings had a new explanation. He'd gone because he feared for his family's security.
So before the whole thing happened with the Prime Minister being sick, my wife calling up on the Friday and everything else, it had already been decided that I was going to move my family out of London, regardless of the COVID rules.
Leaving that information out, he now says, was a mistake.
Just the whole thing was a complete disaster. And the truth is, and that it undermined public confidence in the whole thing.
On the man who he helped into number 10, Mr Cummings now claims Boris Johnson was unfit for office and failed to lock down early enough, either in the spring or autumn, at the cost of tens of thousands of lives, saying he should have told him,
if you announce that you're going to have a lockdown and take serious action now, I will leave, go quietly, we're all friends. If you don't, I'll call a press conference and say the Prime Minister's making a terrible decision that's going to kill thousands of people. And I should have gambled on holding a gun to his head, essentially.
And despite the Prime Minister's denial that he ever said he'd rather let the bodies pile up than order another lockdown, Cummings says,
I heard that in the Prime Minister's study.
Midway through his former aide's evidence, Boris Johnson had to mount his defence at Prime Minister's questions.
None of the decisions have been easy. To go into a lockdown is a traumatic thing for a country. To deal with a pandemic on this scale has been appallingly difficult, and we've at every stage tried to minimise loss of life.
Before he left the building, Mr Cummings was asked whether he regarded the Prime Minister as fit to get us through the rest of the pandemic. No, he replied. After what had come before, no one can have been very surprised. Well, Dominic Cummings is not a popular figure, but not all of his evidence can be discounted as the vengeance of an aide scorned. He painted a detailed picture of a government completely caught on the hop by the pandemic that then failed to learn from its own painful experience, which at the least puts the Prime Minister on the back foot ahead of the public inquiry. And the Health Secretary has totally rejected what Mr Cummings has said. He has been awarded the dubious prize of taking the press conference tomorrow.
Romilly Weeks at Westminster, thank you. Well, our political editor Robert Peston has been following Mr Cummings' testimony today, and he joins us from his studio ahead of the Peston programme later on. Robert, it was pretty compulsive viewing, wasn't it? Really damning testimony from Mr Cummings. But how much damage do you think it will actually do to the government, if any?
Well, look, let's start with the significance of what happened. There is no precedent in modern history for somebody as powerful in government providing such damaging testimony against his boss, the Prime Minister. In fact, you probably have to go back to Henry VIII and, the various advisors to him to come up with any such rebellion against, what somebody would say as an overmighty boss. Now, he called the Prime Minister incompetent. He described the Health Secretary as also as incompetent and as a liar. He gave numerous examples of the government failing to protect us, in particular, failing to protect vulnerable people in care homes. He was damaging to the reputation of the entire civil service and to a large extent some of the scientists who were advising us right at the beginning of the crisis. I mean, for me, the most important part of his evidence related to what happened in September, when he said that he and the chief scientific advisor and the chief medical officer all put pressure on the Prime Minister to lock down. He says that the Prime Minister's personal decision not to lock down cost tens of thousands of lives. And that is a charge that isn't simply going to evaporate.
OK, Robert Peston in West London, thank you. Well, moving on now, and the families of the Hillsborough victims have spoken of their disappointment after the trial collapsed of 3 men accused of altering police statements. They had denied the charges, and today a judge ruled that there was no case to answer. An inquest found the 96 victims of the disaster were unlawfully killed. But today's decision means the only punishment handed out since has been a fine, as Stacey Foster reports.
This was a last chance for justice for the relatives of the 96 Liverpool fans who died at Hillsborough. As the case against 2 former police officers and a solicitor collapsed, they couldn't hide their frustrations.
We're really disappointed. I mean, the families, survivors and fans have fought and battled for over 3 decades for our truth. The truth that we believed in, the truth that we fought for, and today's outcome is just totally devastated us.
After hearing 4 weeks of evidence, the judge said the 3 men had no case to answer.
Are we disappointed that nobody's been held accountable for our 96? Of course we are. We're heartbroken. But the family should never ever feel like they've failed in their loved ones because they've done everything they absolutely can.
An inquiry concluded that the Liverpool fans who died at the FA Cup semi-final in 1989 were unlawfully killed. Since that verdict in 2016, 6 people have faced the courts, but there has only been 1 conviction, which resulted in a £6,500 fine for health and safety breaches. At Anfield, the 96 are permanently remembered, but campaigners say they're still being let down.
Now we've got the death certificate of 96 unlawfully killed, and yet not one person can be held to account, has been held to account for this. To me, that's a disgrace on this nation.
We see history repeated time and time and time again, where ordinary families go through this process and at the end there is no justice.
32 years on, after 96 innocent lives were lost, their families fear nobody will ever be held accountable. Stacey Foster, ITV News, Manchester.
5 men have been arrested in connection with the shooting of the black rights activist Sasha Johnson. The 27-year-old was critically injured after being shot in the head in South London in the early hours of Sunday. The 3 teenagers and 2 older men were arrested on suspicion of attempted murder, as well as other offences. Now, Marks & Spencer has announced further store closures as the impact of the pandemic and the rapid shift to online shopping take their toll. The retailer reported heavy losses for the past year, and as a result, 30 stores will close as part of long-term plans, and others will relocate or become food-only sites. Our business editor Joel Hills has the details.
Bishop Stortford in Hertfordshire has been scarred by coronavirus. Lockdown has knocked holes in shopping parades that will be hard to fill. M&S is still here, but for how much longer isn't clear, because spending habits have changed.
I shop far less on the high street now than I used to.
Yeah, I just try not to go out as much as possible, really.
I shop more online because I'm finding I'm having to, but I much prefer to go out into shops.
In recent years, Marks & Spencer has already retreated from town centres like Boston and Bedford, and there's more upheaval to come. M&S has 255 full-line clothing and food stores in the UK. It plans to shrink this to 180 over the next 10 years. 110 stores in long-term decline will close. 35 of these will relocate, while 45 will become simply food outlets. M&S hasn't said which communities or how many of its 70,000 employees will be affected. The chief executive of Marks & Spencer says he thinks it's likely the company will have more stores in 5 years' time than it does now. But he says more of them will be food only and more of them will be located outside town centres.
Good afternoon, thank you for choosing us.
For this business in the town centre, that's cause for concern.
And the customers in Marks & Spencer's, they come into our spa and use our services. They take that away from us, then all of that custom is going to go from the high street.
M&S says it's traded well since shops reopened 6 weeks ago. Good job too, because all retailers begin paying business rates again from July, and some analysts spy trouble ahead.
We are going to go through a pain barrier of more store closures. We're going to see, unfortunately, probably more names disappear from the high street. They may continue as an online brand.
M&S is upbeat about its prospects. Debt has been reduced and its tie-up with Ocado shows great promise. But a glance at the share price tells you investors can't see blue skies yet. Joel Hills, ITV News, Bishop Stortford.
Still to come in the ITV Evening News, the Manchester United fans descending on Poland for their big European final. And Kate and William back in the town where they first fell in love. Those stories and more after the break. John Wigan. Welcome back. The different rates of stillbirth and infant mortality among ethnic groups in England and Wales has been revealed for the first time. Data from the Office for National Statistics shows rates among black ethnic groups are double that of white babies. Now, the reasons behind the disparity are complex, as our health editor Emily Morgan explains.
It should be the most precious time in a woman's life. But if the baby she was expecting doesn't survive, it can quickly turn to the most tragic. Eva's had 3 stillborns and 2 miscarriages. Babies she calls her angels.
They give you the words, "I'm sorry to say this, there's no heartbeat." That feeling is numbing. Doing it 5 times and still not being successful, it really dents you. It dents your identity, it dents your DNA.
Eva isn't alone. Between 2007 and 2019, the rates of stillbirths did decrease, but they remain highest in black ethnic groups. 7.1 stillbirths are born per 1,000 to black mothers. It's not much higher than the rate among Asian groups, but more than twice that of white babies, where it stands at 3.4 per 1,000. It's a similar picture for infants who die before the age of 1. Birmingham's infant mortality rates are twice that of the national average. A task force here is trying to bring the numbers down. Shabana told me there are complex reasons for unequal outcomes like this.
Social deprivation, poverty, health inequalities within those communities that exist, low levels of literacy, poor housing, a lack of resources and access to healthcare services. So these are the key indicators which determine why mothers and children are having a lot poorer health outcomes.
For those whose job it is to help ensure all babies survive, today's figures are not easy reading.
It is distressing, but it means it's a call to action for us that we need to address these disparities. We need to make sure that we have maternity services that are well funded, that are well staffed, that reflect the communities that we serve.
The government promised to halve stillbirths in England by 2025. Today's figures are perhaps a reminder it's a target to improve outcomes for every single woman. Emily Morgan, ITV News.
Quick note of the news now. In France has announced that travellers from the UK will have to quarantine when they arrive there. It comes amid rising concerns on the continent about the Indian variant of coronavirus. The government here currently advises against travel to France. And Amazon is buying the MGM movie studios in a deal worth £6 billion. Its films include the James Bond franchise, and Amazon says it will boost its online streaming service. Now, in just over an hour, the Europa League final kicks off with Ole Gunnar Solskjaer hoping to win his first trophy as Manchester United manager. Around 2,000 fans have gone to Poland for the game, despite it being on the amber travel list. And many more will be watching from home, as Lucy Watson reports.
British football and its fans are in full voice abroad once again. Manchester United supporters are dancing in the streets of Poland, and this is before their team takes on Spain's Villarreal in the Europa League final.
This feels absolutely amazing. Best feeling in the world. Back to normal. We have missed it.
I'm really excited to be out of the country. I'm really excited to watch United in yet another European final.
Football is life, football is death, and you have to travel.
And 2,000 of them have been allowed to do just that without quarantining, thanks to a special waiver put in place by the Polish authorities. But inside Gdansk Stadium tonight, it'll only be a quarter full because of COVID rules. United take to the pitch as strong favourites, but fans can make the difference.
Football without fans is such a different sport. And have them back again, another game and a final is really good for us.
This has been United's best season for some time. They came second in the Premier League. Their fans have been allowed to travel, and this is their first sniff of silverware in 4 years. Signs point to a good night ahead, whether you're home or abroad.
It just feels great just to get out and watch it in the pub, never mind anywhere else.
It's getting back to normal now, isn't it? It's not far off, we're soon going to be there.
Whoever wins the lucrative prize pot tonight, fans feel like they've struck gold anyway, with football norms making a comeback.
Lucy Watson, ITV News, Manchester.
And finally, people always remember, don't they, where they met the love of their life. For the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, it was at St Andrews in Scotland, where they were university students. Well, 20 years on, they were back again today, visiting some old haunts and renewing their sporting rivalry. Our royal editor Chris Shipp was there.
From afar, they could have been just a couple of students trying out the land yachts, but for both the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, today brought back a lot of memories of a carefree time 20 years ago when they were just Wills and Kate, two undergraduates enjoying student life. The town on the windy coast of Fife is home to Scotland's oldest university. And it was here that a fresh-faced, floppy-haired Prince William was dropped off by his father in 2001. Not quite your average student, but one who wanted to have, as far as he could, a normal life here. And today, the couple were back. A future king and queen, of course, but in the place where their relationship began.
Actually, being a student is a great leveller. One of the things that the Duke really enjoyed about St Andrews was that it treated him as much as it could like anybody else, like any other student.
And it might be 20 years on, but students in this town still talk about the time Wills and Kate were here.
You find out where their flats used to be, which halls they were in. It's always discussed.
Right, is there a guided tour of St Andrews, of places where William and Kate used to live?
Yeah, there probably could be. In cafes, there's signs that, Will and Kate used to go here for coffees.
I think it was Will said that you either leave St Andrews married or an alcoholic. I'm not one of them, but I'm definitely leaning towards one of them.
I won't ask which one. The town has everything a student could want, from places to drink in to places to get a cheap haircut. But Prince William would be the first to admit he doesn't need a barber as much these days as he did back then. Chris Shipp, ITV News, St Andrews.
And that is all for now. Tom Bradby's here with news at 10, but from me and all the team here, bye-bye.